Nano Machine by Hanjo Wiolia. Chapter 373. The Imperial Escort. Part 1. Lim Changhua had started out as a member of the eunuch's initial group and rose to the apex as the Admiral of the East Spear. It was all thanks to his teacher. His teacher had repeatedly taught him that the greatest virtue for a eunuch is to be attentive to everything and anything. Admiral Lim respected his teacher and had always followed his advice meticulously. That was how he had ascended to power. It was the very reason why the current emperor and the crown prince Zhu Taiyun appreciated him so much. Who the hell is he? Whilst on his knees under the intense pressure, he could see that all the people present had familiar faces except for one. Someone he'd never met was there standing amongst the crowd. Although the unknown man didn't look that capable, the eerie feeling he was getting from him as he stood there with long hair and a pale face was overpowering the entire hall. Is that really a human? Quack. My body. Even though the East Spear members tried their hardest, they still couldn't stand. How strong did the man have to be to make everyone fall to their knees from just releasing his aura? Even more surprising, the only people who were kneeling were Zhu Taiyun and the eunuchs. The others were standing on their feet just fine. How is this possible? Elder Chong Su, a longtime elder of the forces of justice, who had been fighting with the eunuchs only a moment before, was doubting his eyes. It wasn't just him, his disciples also weren't being affected by the pressure. Is this even possible? Such a display wasn't something that anyone could just do. This unknown man was acting as if controlling this massive energy was like breathing air. Even Elder Chong Su, who was highly skilled, was shocked by it. Even if the man managed to make sure that his energy wasn't pressuring the others, he and his disciples should at least feel some kind of energy. Impossible. Monster. The disciples of the Kongtong clan were sweating. Shocked, they looked at Elder Chong Su with a puzzled expression, not knowing what to do. When the elder didn't provide them with any information or orders, they decided to call out to him. Elder? Watch quietly, that person must be as strong as one of the five strongest warriors. Five strongest warriors. The elder's words made his disciples go speechless. They'd thought that he was at least a supreme master level warrior, but for him to turn out to be as strong as one of the five strongest warriors was unbelievable. The five strongest warriors of Yulin. If that young man is on the same level as the five strongest warriors, then is he on par with North Justice Blade? Yulin's North Justice Blade, Emok. Emok was one of the strongest leaders in Yulin. At first glance, the unknown man looked the same age as Emok, maybe younger too, but he still gave off a strong aura that rivaled his, maybe even stronger as well. Whoa. We are lucky to have that monster as an ally. In response to the Kongtong clan members' thoughts, the prince, Zhu Taikon, felt happy about the choice that he'd made. He'd thought everything to be lost when the East Spear attacked him, but he'd never imagined that those who wanted to kill him would instead end up on their knees. Haha. At a distance, Crown Prince Zhu Taiyun could be seen on the floor. Zhu Taiyun, abandoning his dignity as a prince, was screaming and whining with his nose stuck to the ground. Not being able to hide his emotions, Zhu Taikon smiled. Right. That was how I felt when it happened to me as well. He felt like he was sharing the same embarrassing moment he'd had to go through at the demonic cult. He felt so happy that he was barely stopping himself from laughing aloud at any moment. On the other hand, Zhu Taiyun's appearance made Admiral Lim go pale. How did such a monster get into the Imperial Palace? The invisible energy was forcefully crushing more than 100 eunuchs. Annihilation didn't seem like a nightmarish dream at all. It wouldn't be too strange if everyone was slaughtered. When that thought crossed his mind, Admiral Lim immediately panicked. Quack. This can't be. In the current situation, the safety of Zhu Taiyun was his top priority. Even if that meant sacrificing all the eunuchs within the hall. We need to escape from here. Admiral Lim looked at the group leader, the super master level eunuch. Unlike the others, this eunuch had been trained well, and had managed to endure the pressure from the energy, yet, he was struggling to stop his head from hitting the ground. Group leader. Admiral Lim. That man is a monster. Calm down. Right now we need to protect the crown prince, it doesn't matter if he is a monster or not. That is true. Despite saying that, the eunuch didn't seem to have any confidence. In the current situation, what could they even do to protect Zhu Taiyun? He and Admiral Lim were the only ones whose heads hadn't been crushed into the floor. I'll use all my energy to attack him. When I do, the pressure from his energy will decrease for a moment. Use it to break away from his pressure and attack him. Admiral Lim thought that even if the man before him was able to bring 100 eunuchs to their knees, he wouldn't be able to do that while dealing with an enemy. There would be a couple of seconds in between which the eunuchs would be able to stand again. Of course, since the man before them was such a monster, the only thing they could gain was a few seconds of time. In the meantime, I will escape with the crown prince. I need to attack? The eunuch group leader was shocked. Admiral Lim was telling him to be a sacrifice so he could escape with the prince. But, Admiral. Are you afraid of being a holy sacrifice for the sake of the prince? I will appoint you as the Deputy Admiral of the East Spear if we can safely escape from here. A tempting offer. Appointing him as the Deputy Admiral meant that his chances to become the next Admiral would grow tremendously. However, the idea of successfully overcoming the crisis against the man seemed absurd. Damn it. The eunuch was afraid, but he could think of no other way out of their situation. He'd always expected to have to make sacrifices in the worst situations, but never had he thought it would come so quickly. I understand. Aim for him after I attack. Shwa. Right after speaking, Admiral Lim collected his energy and jumped into the air. Admiral Lim, whilst midair, put his hand inside his sleeve and brought out a bunch of needles. I need to use this trump card. It was a martial art that he had created using the flower rain sky as a reference. Wave of energy needles. It was a secret technique that would flow in a wave shape whilst forming the internal energy into the shape of needles. It was a skill that consumed a lot of energy, but it was effective enough to annihilate dozens of warriors at once. This will definitely cause enough damage to him. No matter how monstrous he looked, it would be difficult to prevent such an attack. Because the wave of energy needles was a highly advanced technique, it was bound to hit the man. Take this. Swish. 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 Admiral Lim's needles flew in Chen Yuan's direction. That wasn't everything. Whilst the needles from his right hand aimed at Chen Yuan, the needles in his left hand flew off towards Zhu Taikan. Pa. 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 This will be impossible to stop. Admiral Lim was using enough energy to suppress over 100 warriors. To prevent getting hit, the man would have no choice but to remove the energy he was using to suppress the East Spear. Even if he succeeded in defending himself, the other needles would certainly reach the prince. Admiral Lim has executed this perfectly. With this attack, it seemed like the admiral would be able to secure enough time to escape with Zhu Taiyun. However, things don't always go as planned. As soon as he released the secret skill, his attempt to step towards the crown prince simply became impossible. Pa. 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 Admiral Lim couldn't believe his eyes. His more than 100 needles were aimed at Yuan, yet he had slightly stretched out his hand and blocked all of them. Crazy bastard. He was so shocked that he burst out swearing. As if the needles had been blocked by an invisible wall, they all stopped mid-air. How can he do that? Without removing the energy that continued to pressure the members of the East Spear, he'd stop the needles that were charging towards him. It was an impossible task unless he was someone who had an insane amount of experience and precision. Unknown to him, however, Chen Yuan had Nano. Erosion succeeded. Master's energy has successfully infiltrated the needles and has gained control of them. Nano's voice rang in his mind. This attack doesn't even impress me. Yo. Embarrassed by Yuan's words, Admiral Lim took out all the remaining needles and attacked him once again, but Yuan extended his hand and ordered Nano. Nano, send these needles back at him. Following Master's command. Activating the panel remote system on the needles. Target, the needles user. Beep. 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 Chen Yuan's eyes shook rapidly, creating red cross-shaped particles, all aimed at Admiral Lim. Wing. The needles, which had stopped mid-air, flipped around. What the hell are you doing? Just returning what's yours. Two. As soon as Chen Yuan finished speaking, the needles aimed at Admiral Lim flew towards him like a storm. This. He was used to being attacked, but never with his own methods. More than 100 needles were flying back towards him at twice the speed he'd shot them out. In the same way Admiral Lim had done it, the wave approached him. Phut. As Chen Yuan stretched out his hand, the wave devoured the Admiral. He is doing it better than Admiral Lim himself. Pooh. 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 Quack. Unfortunately for him, attacking Chen Yuan was the worst thing he could have done. Unlike Admiral Lim's attacks, which were directed at random parts of the body, Chen Yuan's attacks were aimed at only one spot. Which meant that there would be a shower of needles, a marvelous show that could never be stopped. Thud. Ugh, you monstrous demon. Admiral Lim's body was on the floor with many needles pierced into his body. Maybe because he had used his remaining energy to protect his body, the needles hadn't penetrated entirely, but had only shallowly penetrated his body. Admiral Lim, who was in extreme pain, eyed the eunuch group leader with anger in his eyes. Ugh, what the hell is he doing? According to the plan, that eunuch was supposed to hit Chen Yuan from behind. However, when he looked over, he realized that the eunuch had been blocked by the guards and was unable to move. What the hell? The one who had blocked the eunuch was Yan Namgun. The eunuch had tried to move right away to attack Chen Yuan, but Namgun along with the guards had stopped him. He thought that he could go past the guards, but that wasn't possible for him. Wing. The guards had a woman called Ranyang on their side. She spread the flames on her sword and pierced the group leader's shoulder. Chiik. Quack. With the sword on fire, he didn't actually bleed, but flame chi was quickly rushing into his body. He'd wanted to get rid of the monster, but the woman had interfered. Don't you dare try to attack my lord. Hu Bong, one of the guards, held a sword of flame. Caught by unestimated variables, the eunuch couldn't help but fall back. What the hell is that guy doing? Admiral Lim was confused. Around Zhu Taikan, who was supposed to have no allies, unidentified warriors kept on appearing. The other needles? Naturally, the needle attack on Zhu Taikan had been blocked by Ranyang, who had created a pillar of flame and turned the needles into ashes. Ugh, where did these people come from? Quack. Bang. When everything seemed to be in vain, Admiral Lim screamed as his head touched the floor. No matter what he did, it would be pointless. His ambition to safeguard the prince vanished in an instant. It can't be, so easily. Admiral Lim is down? one of the great masters of the Imperial Palace, for him to be so helpless. The eunuchs who were on their knees were stunned by the unexpected results. No one could have predicted that Lim Changhua, East Spear's admiral who was considered to be one of the strongest in the Imperial Palace, would be so miserably defeated. Step. 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 Chen Yuan approached him. Admiral Lim looked up at him from below and spoke with red eyes. "You freaking bastard! Who the hell are you? How dare you stand in front of the admiral? This monster could never be a member of the Guardians." It just felt very unfair. Looking down at the admiral with cold eyes, Yuan opened his mouth. "I am the guy you tried to frame." "What? Frame?" Hearing those ambiguous words, Admiral Lim was utterly puzzled. He couldn't figure out what he meant. Until an illogical thought that made totally no sense to him suddenly crossed his mind. "Wait, are you the demonic cult?" The monstrous man in front of him. Chen Yuan, the Lord of the 10,000 Mountains, the Lord of the demonic cult. How did this happen? I guess you do realize the sin you committed now. Then you must know your fate too, right? Listening to his words, Admiral Lim shouted in anger. "Well, wait. I am the Admiral of the Empire. Even if you are from demonic / Even before he could complete his words, the sword passed swiftly through his neck. It was so sudden that the Admiral hadn't even realized what had just happened to him. "So what if you are the Emperor's men?" Thud. He seemed like he was trying to say something, but his head was already on the ground, cleanly separated from its body. Chapter 374. The Imperial Escort. Part 2. No. Admiral Lim. Ugh. He beheaded the Admiral? The whispers and screams of the East Spear's eunuchs began erupting within the hall. Still, not a single person in the Imperial Palace had ever imagined that Admiral Lim, who was known for his overpowering skills, would be taken down as simply as a bird getting hit by an arrow. Quack. Not a single person from the East Spear could avenge their admiral. The reality of kneeling helplessly only made them feel even more miserable. He was really beheaded. Even Zhu Taikon couldn't help but be shocked. He had personally crossed paths with Chen Yuan in the demonic cult, and he knew that he would punish the admiral, but never had he imagined that he would decapitate an Imperial Palace official. I thought that he would be conscious of the non-aggression treaty between Wulin and the Emperor. Chen Yuan was currently in the Imperial Palace, which was at the center of the empire. The prince had thought that no matter how reckless the Lord of Demonic Cult was, he wouldn't take an official's life so easily. The prince couldn't understand what Chen Yuan was thinking. They are definitely different from the rest of Yulin. Zhu Taikon glanced at the elder from the Kongtong clan. The disciples and members of the Kongtong clan had suppressed the eunuchs without spilling any blood or taking any lives, all in order to respect the treaty. Ugh! Heavenly God! Heavenly God! How could this? The expression of Elder Chong Su, a longtime member of the Emperor Yulin Alliance, wore a serious expression. It wasn't because Admiral Lim Changhua had lost his life, but because of what he heard him say before he died. What did I hear just now? As a superior master-level warrior, he had enhanced hearing, which meant he could listen to almost everyone's voices within the underground hall if he wanted. Admiral Lim had called the young monster that stood before him, the Lord of the Demonic Cult, before dying. He is the Lord of the Demonic Cult. He had assumed that Yuan was someone close to the Imperial family. However, when he heard the word demonic cult, he couldn't help but be surprised. This man had not just entered the palace, his actions would also cause huge political changes. He must be Chen Yuan. He'd heard about the new lord of the demonic cult through Jigel Sohi, a strategist who had been sent along with an envoy to the demonic cult. It hadn't been very long since the young man had become the lord of demonic cult, and he had sent official messengers to Yulin. At that time, Yulin had gone over to the cult to meet with Chen Yuzhong, previous lord of demonic cult and one of the 5 strongest of Wulin, for the sake of establishing an agreement. He is still a child? What a joke! All that he'd heard from the meeting seemed to be lies. This person was no child, but a devilish monster. He wasn't a growing dragon, but a full-grown dragon. Young Woon ah. Changsu telepathically called out to one of his disciples. Elder? Pay attention to that man's clothing and facial features. When we return back to our clan, you will have to draw a portrait. Excuse me? His disciple Young Wu was puzzled at his request. Realizing the doubts his disciple had, the elder spoke. That person is the lord of demonic cult, Chen Yuan. Demonic cult. Lord of demonic cult? Young Woon couldn't help but be shocked at the words, Lord of the demonic cult. He looked young, yet had such tremendous power. It wasn't surprising that the disciple had thought that it was some elderly man who had gone through a metamorphosis, but for him to be the lord of the demonic cult. Then more important things quickly ran through his mind. Who could the demonic cult members be in this place? Although they had formed an alliance with the demonic cult, the lord of demonic cult is an enemy force with which Yulin had been in constant confrontations for hundreds of years. Such a person was invading the Imperial Palace without any prior notice. There will certainly be a riot in Yulin because of this. If it wasn't for the existing alliance, the situation would have caused a huge stir. Elder Changsu warned his disciple who wasn't able to control his expressions. First, calm your expressions. Don't even think about talking or looking like you know they belong to the demonic cult. Understood. Even though he responded, Young Wu couldn't help but feel disappointed. It looked like Elder Changsu, one of the 17 leaders of Yulin, who was known to be a strong warrior, was afraid of confronting the lord of the demonic cult. Even though he could fight him and claim it to be for political reasons. Step. Step. Whilst the two of them were talking telepathically, Chen Yuan walked towards Zhu Taiyun. None of the eunuchs could stop him. I shouldn't let him go there. Ugh, my body can't move. Their knees were glued to the floor, and they lacked the energy to stand up. In fact, after watching their admiral get beheaded, they had realized that they were nothing but tiny ants compared to him. The funny thing was, despite being released from the pressure, not a single eunuch stood up. Drop. 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 Drops of blood were falling while Chen Yuan was walking. It was Admiral Lim's blood dripping from the sword he held in his right hand. The eunuchs, who were already in shock from fear and intimidation, didn't even think about rebelling. Whack, whack, whack. Zhu Taiyun, the crown prince, still had his nose, which was bleeding, stuck to the ground. His dignity as a prince had been damaged, and he was even angrier that he couldn't lift his head. Roll. That was when something rolled towards him. This? Upon looking at what it was, Zhu Taiyun was so startled that he desperately wanted to move away from it. That. Admiral Lim. It was Admiral Lim's head. He'd never been to a battlefield. This was his first time seeing a decapitated human head. And since it was the head of someone he knew very well, the impact was even greater. Waha. Not being able to stand the sight, he ended up throwing up. Zhu Taiyun, who threw up for quite a while, looked up at Chen Yuan. Throughout his entire life, which had been without any obstructions, Chen Yuan was his first barrier. Ugh, who is this monster blocking my path of becoming the emperor? If everything had gone according to plan, I could have had everything in my hand. Sometimes, to overcome fear, letting anger take over was effective. It is all because of you. How dare you, a worthless member of Yulin, look into the eyes of the future emperor? Woong. Quack. My body. Before he could even release his anger, the prince's body began to float midair. Chen Yuan took 2 steps forward and approached Zhu Taiyun, before looking at him with a cold gaze, and then spoke. Such wild running tongues need to be cut. What? How dare? Thanks for your hard work alongside the Blade God's 6 martial clan, on trying to frame my cult, Your Highness Crown Prince. Cult? When Chen Yuan mentioned the clan and their joining hands, Zhu Taiyun's eyes went wide. At first, he thought that the man was just someone that Zhu Taikon had brought in from some Yulin clan. However, the man had said himself that he was from the demonic cult. No. Demonic cult? See? You do know us well. No? How can the demonic cult be here, in the palace? When Zhu Taiyun found out that Chen Yuan was from the demonic cult, he couldn't hide his embarrassment. When they were executing the plan, a plan that had been brought forward by the person called Master Dogun, a member of the Blade God's 6 martial clan, and Admiral Lim, the master had assured them that there would be no problem in the execution of the plan and with blaming the crime on the demonic cult, because it was located to the south of the Yellow River. What exactly went wrong? Even before the plan's execution, the demonic cult had appeared. Zhu Taiyun tried to move his body, but he couldn't. Chen Yuan spoke again. It has been good knowing you. Now please get ready to pay the price. As he said that, Chen Yuan raised his right hand, and Zhu Taiyun, who felt something ominous, shouted out with a pale face. What are you planning on doing? I am the Crown Prince of the Empire. How dare you subject a member of the Imperial family to? Thud. Before Zhu Taiyun could finish, Chen Yuan moved his right hand, and the prince's elbow broke. Quack. The bones from his elbow protruded through the skin. It was impossible for Crown Prince Zhu Taiyun to endure such pain. Clicking his tongue, Chen Yuan spoke. So what if you are from the Imperial family? If the Imperial family was so high and mighty, they shouldn't have resorted to such cheap tactics. The eunuchs immediately grew furious hearing their princes scream. How dare you? For you to hurt his highnesses. Retreat before we charge you. No matter how frightened they felt, their loyalty to the Imperial family was stronger. 3 eunuchs, having been enraged, wielded their high-wave swords and charged towards Chen Yuan. Cha! 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 The swords, which could curl like whips, were aimed at Chen Yuan from 3 directions. Ugh! What is this? Their bodies, which were supposed to move, came to a halt. Not knowing what was happening to them, they grew stiff as dolls, and their faces crumbled into pure fear. Without even looking at them, Yuan spoke. I assume you don't value your lives. What? Swish. Chen Yuan raised his left hand and pretended to turn something. The necks of all 3 eunuchs suddenly snapped. Crack. Quack. Screaming in pain, they died with their necks twisted at an odd angle. It was an effective example. Realizing that Chen Yuan showed no mercy to anyone, the eunuchs paled. He killed them. This overwhelmingly strong man didn't care if it was an imperial official or a prince. He was a real tyrant. Zhu Taiyun, who had been screaming in pain because of his broken arm, yelled with bloody eyes. Quiet! How dare you, an insignificant being, break the arm of an imperial family member? Whack, whack. I will make sure that every member of the demonic cult suffers. Crack. Quack. While he was still screaming, Zhu Taiyun's left arm was also broken. Like his right arm, the bone protruded from the elbow. Zhu Taiyun abandoned his dignity as a member of the imperial family and began shedding tears. This guy is the real deal. Only then did Zhu Taiyun sense that his life was in danger. He knew that if the man that stood before him got upset, he would really kill everyone. The people of Yulin and even the clan heads would always bow their heads before the imperial family and imperial officials, but this man absolutely wouldn't do so. This is the demonic cult. This was completely different from Yulin. Without even blinking, he had broken the arm of a crown prince. As if he wasn't done, Chen Yuan moved his hand once more. Eek! Fear sank into Zhu Taiyun's bones as he worried that something else in his body would be broken, so he cried out. Don't! I strayed from the right path. No, no prince would break his promise. Please, please let me go. I beg of you. Words asking for forgiveness came out of his arrogant mouth. He knew that arrogant words would lead to his death. As he kept shouting for forgiveness and shedding tears, Chen Yuan muttered to him. If you had continued to talk nonsense, I would have been able to cut off an arm. TCH, what a pity that I didn't get to do that. A arm? Creepy. Just those words caused the crown prince to shiver as a chill ran down his spine. Chen Yuan looked at someone and opened his mouth again. Well, since my anger has been resolved to some extent, I will hand your highness over to the prince as promised. Promised? Ugh. His body, which was afloat, began moving. Chen Yuan moved his hand in a particular direction and the crown prince's body followed accordingly. Zhu Taiyun's body moved towards Zhu Taikon. Thud. Quack. He fell to the floor as the force keeping his body disappeared. Do whatever you want with him. At Chen Yuan's words, the smile on Zhu Taikon's face reached his ears. Is your arm okay, brother? His voice contained not 1 ounce of concern. Rather, it was closer to sarcasm. Zhu Taikon. You bastard. Zhu Taiyun was on the floor, feeling nothing but utter disgrace, while Prince Zhu Taikon looked down on him with a pleased gaze. How did I fall into such a humiliating position? As the situation turned against him, the crown prince was regretting his choices. As a result of his greed, he had wanted to overthrow Zhu Taikon and even the supreme commander, but his greed had only brought humiliation. Zhu Taikon spoke to him. Are you going to admit your loss? It is truly a pity that the carefully devised plan of yours has failed so miserably. Thud. At those words, Zhu Taiyun barely opened his mouth and spoke through grunting teeth. I witnessed the death of Admiral Lim. No matter how many witnesses there are, do you really think that His Majesty would trust the son of a concubine over me? The plan had definitely failed. However, even if it had failed, there was a fatal weakness for Zhu Taikon. He was the child of a concubine, and not the empress. Even if Zhu Taiyun was pushed away, the emperor's favor would fall onto the third prince Zhu Tizong. Elder Chongsu. Yes. Your Highness. At the sudden call from Zhu Taiyun, Elder Chongsu, who was watching the situation, answered with an uneasy voice. In a pleading tone, Zhu Taiyun spoke. This crown prince was too blind and ended up getting mixed up with the wrong people. I hope you don't get involved in this. Huh. Even when this situation turned out to be as horrible as it was, Zhu Taiyun actually refused to give up. Even Elder Chongsu was at a loss for words. When he'd first arrived at the Imperial Palace as an envoy, he'd felt that crown. Prince Zhu Taiyun was quite ambitious. But now his lust for power was the only thing he could see. If the members of your clan turn away from this situation, you will never become the next heir. What? Who dares to, ugh? Zhu Taiyun, who'd become angry at the voice of someone interrupting his words, tried to get up. However, he was too exhausted to move. Hack. This Prince Zhu Taikon greets the Great Emperor. The Great Emperor. Starting with Zhu Taikon's cry, all the officials inside the underground hall knelt before the dignified man in a golden robe who was standing at the entrance. Zhu Taiyun, who was in shock, spoke in a trembling voice. Ugh, Why is His Majesty in the royal shrine. The person who had majestically appeared in the shrine was Zhu Taiyuan, Emperor of the Demyong Empire. Chapter 375. The Imperial Escort. Part 3. A face that portrayed the dignity and majestic look of a dragon. The middle-aged man in golden robes didn't even need to speak for others to understand that he was an authoritative figure. Before them stood the Emperor, Zhu Taiyuan. Why is His Majesty here? Are they all coming? Crown Prince Zhu Taiyuan, whose eyes had fallen onto the people standing behind the emperor, soon fell into an abyss of total despair and utter fear. The one who was dressed in a polished red robe and splendid ornaments was Admiral Yuk Chang'an of the West Spear, standing in front of his two attendants. He was the man in charge of auditing within the Imperial Palace. To the right of Admiral Yuk Chang'an stood three eunuchs in navy blue uniforms. It was the Cardinal Spear Admiral, Xiao Taisik, and his two attendants. The Imperial Palace's top two eunuchs, who wielded undisputed power, had appeared alongside the Emperor. Furthermore, Supreme Commander, standing on the right side of the Emperor, wearing a formal second-class robe, was a handsome middle-aged man, the first head of the guards and the Supreme Commander, Baek Jae-jai. Next to him stood a person who radiated a unique energy, the Northern Commander, Yang Zhou. All the leaders of the Imperial Palace's martial artists had gathered in the underground shrine. The Emperor is here too. This is troublesome. Despite the Emperor's entry, Chen Youwen looked mysteriously calm. It wasn't a surprise to him as he'd already sensed their energy when they entered the royal shrine. He was only concerned about two things. Your Majesty. Ta. 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 Thud. Zhu Taiyuan, who was in absolute shock and disbelief, immediately ran over to the Emperor and fell to his knees. His two broken arms, his elbow that was sticking out, and the bleeding from his nose, drew the picture of the merciless torture and the painful suffering he had gone through. Your Majesty. Please save me. The prince plotted to kill me, Admiral Lim lost his life and I was hit and injured. Prince Zhu Taikon couldn't hold back the gasp as he heard the crown prince's words and noticed his sudden change of attitude. He'd always known that the crown prince behaved differently in front of the Emperor, and as expected, the crown prince hadn't deviated much from his nature. However, the eyes of the Emperor, who would normally listen attentively to his eldest son, were cold. Your Majesty. Such icy coldness flustered Zhu Taiyuan. As he was the eldest son and the only son of the deceased empress, the Emperor always treated him with warmth and affection. However, at that moment, the Emperor's eyes were full of disappointment and distress. No. It isn't true. Your Majesty. No. Father. This is all, can't you just shut your mouth? Zhu Taiyuan had been desperately trying to persuade the Emperor, but his expression stiffened at that moment. As the Emperor yelled at him, Zhu Taiyuan's mind went blank. Do you think that I, the Emperor, lack ears and eyes? I have always given you second chances when you made mistakes, but this time you crossed the line. Ugh, this isn't. Did you think that I wouldn't know what you and your partners were up to? The Emperor's sharp words cut so deeply in Zhu Taiyuan's heart that his words got stuck in his throat. Although he'd managed to gain the support of many officials, including Admiral Lim, making them his sworn allies, the power in the Imperial Palace always revolved around the Emperor. This meant that there was no corner within the Imperial Palace where the Emperor's eyes and ears were absent. No, it is a misunderstanding. Admiral Lim and I discovered that the second prince had teamed up with the demonic cult to steal the treasure of His Majesty, the Emperor. The Emperor's disappointment deepened at Zhu Taiyuan's words, as he desperately insisted on his innocence. The Emperor summoned Xiao Taisik, the Admiral of the Cardinal Spear, who was standing behind him. Admiral Xiao. Yes, Your Majesty. Call them. Upon hearing the Emperor's command, Admiral Seo Tae-sik looked at the officials in the room and shouted. The inspection duty has been successfully executed at the command of His Majesty. Inspection? Zhu Taiyun didn't understand what was being said, especially the inspection they were talking about. But he soon found out. Among the East Spear eunuchs who were laying flat on the floor and bowing their heads, 5 eunuchs got up and approached the Emperor, who was near the entrance. What? Who are they? The eunuchs who approached the Emperor quickly knelt onto one knee. The one in the lead shouted. The group leader of Cardinal Spear, Shim Hyung, has finished the inspection duty and greets His Majesty. Speak up. Zhu Taiyun's face hardened. Shockingly, all 5 eunuchs were Cardinal Spear members. Why were they in here? Zhu Taiyun was too shocked to understand. He'd never expected something like this to happen. He'd thought that they were East Spear eunuchs who'd been working along with him. Even the group leader of the East Spear, the eunuch who had been promised the deputy admiral post, was perplexed. Damn it! We did our best to find the spies, and they were right next to us the entire time. The so-called East Spear didn't even know that it still had spies of West Spear and Cardinal Spear within it. To prevent the 3 eunuchs' organizations from growing addicted to power and to keep everyone in check, each one had its own spies within the 2 other organizations. However, the East Spear had thought that they'd removed all the spies, thus it was totally unexpected to see 5 spies suddenly pop out. Well, identifying a spy was the toughest task when an organization was made up of numerous people. Report. We have received the order. The leader of the group, who had completed the inspection at the order of His Admiral Seo Tae-sik, told everything he knew about Zhu Taiyun's and Admiral Lim's scheme. It was about half a year ago when I began my duties as an East Spear guard. 3 months ago, we noticed that the Crown Prince would frequently visit the East House, the headquarters of the East Spear. And, since he wasn't a high-ranked member, he wasn't able to gather full details on what happened, but he'd realized that Zhu Taiyun had joined hands with the members of the Blade God 6 martial clan. The mouths of the Cardinal Spear attendants went wide whilst Zhu Taiyun's face turned as white as a ghost's. After the entire report was given, the Emperor spoke in a cold voice. Did you just attack the royal shrine and annihilate the guardians, just to ascend the throne? Why, Your Majesty? I am extremely disappointed. It is my fault that you turned out like this. You should have been raised strictly, just like the other princes. Rather than blaming the culprit, the Emperor blamed himself for not disciplining his son. Zhu Taiyun, who was already drowning in deep despair, blanked out as the world turned pitch black in his eyes. Knowing the stubborn nature of the Emperor, it was meaningless to make excuses, especially since the report had already been given. Supreme Commander. Arrest them immediately and take everyone into custody. At the Emperor's orders, a smile of satisfaction appeared on the Supreme Commander's face. He had felt humiliated when the East Spear had tried to arrest the guards, but since the situation had been reversed, he couldn't hide his smile. The world is truly unpredictable. Receive the orders from Your Majesty. Northern Commander. Yes. Fulfill Your Majesty's orders. When the Guard Supreme Commander called for Yongzhou, the Northern Commander, he moved right away as if waiting for the orders to fall. Step, 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 step. At the same time, armor-clad guards began appearing and lining up in the underground hall. The number of guards who kept pouring in was hard to count. Ah. What? So many? Zhu Taiyun's eyes shone. As the line of guards kept on pouring in like water, the entire hall seemed to be filled with them. The number of guards had already reached 200. The Northern Commander then loudly ordered them arrest all the eunuchs of the East Spear. Yes. Anger and excitement appeared on the guards' faces since they had been waiting for this very day. A golden opportunity to pay back the eunuchs for all the ill treatment they'd dished out to them. Don't move. Admiral Lim was already dead, and the emperor himself had appeared to send their souls to hell. The eunuchs had already realized that East Spear was going to become a forgotten history. The only thing left for them to do was get dragged around by ropes. The emperor didn't stop there, and with a voice still full of rage and fury, he pointed to Zhu Taiyun and gave another order. Take him as well, and lock him up in his palace. Ugh. At the emperor's command, the guards approached Zhu Taiyun, who was miserably kneeling on the floor. Forgive our rudeness, Your Highness. Since he was from the Imperial family, the guards couldn't tie him up with rope, so they lifted him up by his broken arms. Zhu Taiyun, who was being dragged out, shouted with all his might, realizing that it was his last chance. Father! You can't do this. That filthy bastard Zhu Taikon colluded with Yulin members and with the demonic cult too. He killed the East Spear Admiral and made me like this. Why are you treating me like this? He cried and shouted, but the emperor didn't even look at him. The disappointment his son made him feel had reached its peak. Father! Father! Please! Zhu Taiyun's happy dream of getting everything he wanted had in a very short space of time turned into a hellish nightmare. It was even more shocking that even after being dragged out, his father, the emperor, wasn't responding to him. Your Majesty took a step ahead, so the plot of the Crown Prince has ended in failure. A cold-hearted emperor who didn't let injustice happen, even when committed by his beloved son. When the Crown Prince's voice could no longer be heard in the underground hall, the emperor moved in steady steps from the entrance to the middle of the hall. Now that my beloved son's business has been taken care of, I need to take care of the other matters. Following the emperor, the two admirals, their attendants, the supreme commander and the northern commander moved, but that wasn't the end. Eunuchs of the West Spear and Cardinal Spear rushed in and formed two lines, encircling the outer perimeter of the hall. He brought everyone? Zhu Taikon couldn't hide his shock. He thought that everything had been resolved, but that didn't seem to be the case. There were around 400 people within the hall at the moment. Unlike the emperor, who was still full of dignity, the expressions of the two admirals and the supreme commander were distorted. The reason was simple. How rude! How dare you stand tall when His Majesty, the great emperor of the empire, has arrived? The supreme commander yelled furiously. Previously, when the emperor had arrived in the underground hall of the royal shrine, Zhu Taikon and the others had immediately fallen to their knees. However, there were a few people who simply hadn't done so. They were Chen Youan, a man with long black hair, and 4 people who were wearing guards' uniforms. The emperor had kept his mouth shut because he'd decided to deal with his son and the East Spear first. But now that they had been removed, the actions of these 4 people were simply unacceptable to him. That unit is a mess. They seem to belong to the southern unit, but how could these people commit such blasphemy in His Majesty's presence? In the eyes of the Supreme Commander, Baek Jae-jai, the men in the guard's uniform had to kneel and greet the emperor. Of course, it wasn't just the guards, anyone in the empire had to kneel in front of His Majesty. Well, you see, I can't get down on my knee right now. Swoosh! Why, Your Majesty? It was the emperor who had stopped the supreme commander from charging ahead. When the emperor raised his hand and signaled him to stop, the supreme commander who wanted to say something went silent. To disobey the emperor's orders meant to betray his authority. Are these the Wulin members who came with you? Zhu Taikon, who was still kneeling, was shocked. Although he hadn't yet revealed who they were, the emperor managed to infer the relationship between him and them with his insight. Of course, it was just his prediction, based solely on the fact that they hadn't knelt. No, I didn't bring them in, but they did help me. Zhu Taikon spoke cautiously. The emperor is scary, but he is nothing compared to Chen Yuan. After hearing his words, the emperor seemed to think for a moment. There is no way that Yulin people could be this bold. So, they must be from there? He hadn't witnessed everything. However, the emperor had seen the young man in black robes brutally breaking the arms of his eldest son, Zhu Taiyun. He never involved private life with work matters, but he couldn't help but feel offended. Looking at Chen Yuan and the guards, the emperor opened his mouth. You are from the demonic cult? The only people of Wulin who could have come into contact with Zhu Taikan were the members of the demonic cult, where he was sent as an envoy. It was impossible for the Yulin groups to help him. Chen Yuan, who was still watching, put his hands together and said, I wanted to leave once I managed to settle things quietly, but as you know, things never go as planned. It is an honor to meet your majesty. I am Chen Yuan, the current lord of demonic cult. Lord? The emperor's eyes widened at the word lord. He knew that this man was strong. This was made clear when he broke Zhu Taiyun's arm without touching him, but for him to be the lord of demonic cult was unpredictable. Grrrr. Unlike the emperor, who was shocked, the commanders and the admirals were angry. Although the Imperial family and Wulin had a non-aggression treaty, Chen Yuan's actions could be considered treason in the eyes of others. Bang! Kwakwa. West Spear Admiral Yek Chang'an, a superior master, stepped forward with anger. With each step he took, the floor below cracked. Yek Chang'an, thinking that he had fully demonstrated his power, shouted in a voice filled with rage. You are being rude. How dare you act like that towards the emperor? You will have to suffer. Chuck. Ah. The sharp tip of a sword suddenly touched his neck. When did this sword? The Admiral of West Spear hadn't even seen the sword being drawn. A moment before, they'd looked like normal guards, but now one of them was pointing his sword at his neck. Old eunuchs don't get to be disrespectful towards the lord of the demonic cult. The non-aggression treaty was signed with both parties on equal footing. We don't work under you. Swift swordsmanship. You must be Mara Kim. It was Great Guardian Mara Kim, wearing his mask. Northern Commander Yangzhou was the one who guessed his identity. Commander Yangzhou, who was said to be the best swordsman in the Imperial Palace, had acquaintances with the people of Yulin. He was able to identify this man, because of the constant orders he received from the Emperor to observe the Wulin. Your reputation undermines you. You are called the King of Death, because you control life and death on the battlefield. But... Clang! Yangzhou drew his sword from its sheath and aimed it at Mara Kim. With a cold look, that clearly said that he was displeased. How dare you draw your sword in front of His Majesty, the Emperor of the Demyang Empire, and endanger a member of his court, an admiral at that? Thud. 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 As soon as he was done speaking, the guards began to move with their shields held ahead of them. This was an army tactic meant to lower the morale of the enemy. However, it lowered no one's morale, but only riled up the hearts of the demonic cult members. Chew. Huh. Flame Chi? A sword moved on its own, drew a line on the ground in front of the guards, and slashed a couple of shields. Thanks to that, the guards had no choice but to stop. Whoa. Fack. In front of those guards, a person from Chen Yuan's side, donned in a guard's uniform, walked over and blocked their way forward, to stop them from taking another step forward. Red hair was revealed under the man's helmet. He was Li Hamming. Who? Li Hamming's sword blazed with flames. This is a warning. Those who draw their swords will be killed right away. A warning which instilled fear in everyone's hearts. As a result, the guards gulped without realizing it. Fire, Fire King. A sigh escaped from Yangzhou's mouth. The moment he saw the red hair, he immediately recognized who it was. The lord of the demonic cult. the King of Death and the Fire King? How could these monsters infiltrate the Imperial Palace without anyone's knowledge? Ugh. The new lord of the demonic cult wasn't very famous in the palace, but everyone in Wooleen knew how strong the two guardians were. They were amazingly skilled martial artists and heartless merciless monsters. Tack. One of the people who was still kneeling suddenly stood up. A woman with a seductive body and hair falling down to her waist. The commanders knew her very well. Oh. Guardian. They thought that it was a good thing that they had her in the midst of the messy situation with the demonic cult. If the Guardian, Ranyang, the strongest hidden warrior in the Imperial Palace came forward, then even the demonic cult would have a hard time. He might be the Fire King. But she is a woman who has lived for hundreds of years. No matter how skilled those people are, they are nothing but children in front of her long experience and massive skill. Hee. Wing. As flames swirled around her body, she looked like the incarnation of the Qilin. At her magnificence, Admiral Siotaisky smiled. People of the demonic cult, you only have fire on your sword, but this is the true power of the Imperial Palace. Hing. Hold on. Admiral Siotaisik, who was feeling triumphant, couldn't believe his eyes. Ranyang's flames, which were supposed to threaten the demonic cult, unexpectedly encircled the guards and eunuchs. They were being isolated from their allies. This, Guardian. What is this supposed to mean? Ignoring the bewildered question of Admiral Siotaisik, Ranyang shouted to the 300 people who had been blocked by the flames. Whoever threatens the lord of the demonic cult, I, Ranyang, vow to burn them to ashes. Upon hearing the strangest thing ever, the commanders grew utterly speechless. A woman who was supposed to be their strongest ally had just given them an extremely aggressive warning. Chapter 376. The Imperial Escort. Part 4. An Imperial Guardian, a hidden power that protected the royal shrine. Even within the Imperial Palace, very few knew of her existence. Only the Emperor and his commanders and a few admirals that protected him knew of her existence. Ranyang. The incarnation of the Qilin exists only for the sake of protecting the Imperial treasure. Instead of protecting them, her flames were directed to the guards. It's been 20 years since I last saw you. The Emperor seemed to remember something as he tried to maintain a calm expression. The first time they'd met had been the day he inherited the throne. As a young and energetic emperor, he had fallen in love with her bewitching charming red hair that could never be seen in the outside world. Her beauty is still there. It was astonishing that her mesmerizing beauty still remained. However, from that day onwards, he stopped visiting her as he had learned that she had been protecting the treasure in the royal shrine since the foundation of the empire. Do you realize the meaning of your actions? Guardian. Supreme Commander Bek Jajai shouted with a red face. It was totally unacceptable that the hidden power protecting the Imperial treasure was now backstabbing the Emperor. Imperial Guard's Supreme Commander. I have seen you before as a young soldier, and now you've gotten strong enough to yell at a woman. Soldier. Although he was under the Emperor, he was still the highest-ranking official in the Imperial Guards. Bek Jajai, who had been brought into the Northern Commanders group because of his extensive field experience, quickly became a provincial commander at the young age of 34. Cough. Bek Jajai was flustered by Ranyang's words and coughed. He had met her for the first time the day he was appointed as a provincial commander, and a few embarrassing things had happened between them. This is funny, for a woman to be the strongest guardian in the Imperial Palace. Wing. Ugh. My uniform is on fire. He'd made fun of her, and Ranyang had burned his uniform. Those embarrassing memories rushed back into his mind. Why talk about the past? Guardian. It is treason. Protecting the demonic cult which is trying to hurt the Emperor is treason. Clang. The Supreme Commander had drawn his most treasured sword, which he almost never drew. It was a famous sword whose sharpness increased the stronger the opponent was. When he saw the engraving on the sword's body, Li Hongming's eyes lit up. Noble warrior's sword. Noble warrior's sword. This famous sword had been made by Ojizi, a master craftsman from the Chu dynasty. Although not made of cold steel, the swords made by him were known to be sharp enough to decapitate a horse's or a cow's head in a single stroke. Whoa! The noble warrior's sword released a bluish-black energy. I will punish you with the sword given to me by His Majesty. Baek Jae-jai, who had garnered numerous achievements whilst subjugating the barbarians of the north during the former emperor's rule, was given one of the 10 famous swords which were kept as properties of the imperial family. That sword is the real thing. Even Li Hongming, who rarely showed interest in such things, was clearly interested in this treasured sword. On the other hand, Baek Jae-jai, who pulled out the sword, was staring intently into Ranyang's eyes. Guardian. I believe that you haven't forgotten your eternal loyalty to His Majesty. The former emperor was very interested in martial arts. He would often bring soldiers from the imperial palace to compete with Ranyang. At that time, the noble warrior's sword was always brought into the underground shrine for those battles. I don't know what kind of trick they played on you, but please see the truth and come back to His Majesty's side. That was Baek Jae-jai's real purpose. To remind her of the memories and the loyalty she was supposed to show to the empire. He thought it was probably a lapse in her judgment that made her decide to turn her back on the empire where she'd spent nearly 200 years. Fat. Baek Jae-jai jumped forwards and reached for Ranyang, who stood in front of Chen Yuan. Baek Jae-jai was now retired from active duty, but he still remained the supreme commander. His splendid sword, which was emitting devastating energy, drew numerous rays in the air at the same time. Cha! 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 They all contained the intent to cut her down. The attack was supposed to strike her vertically, cutting her into two. However, even as he approached, Ranyang didn't move a single step. This energy? The energy his sword exuded seemed familiar to her. However, she knew that she couldn't move from her position. Wing! As she raised her right hand, a wall of flame soared into the air. Despite his attack being so sophisticated, the sword rays disappeared immediately when blocked by the defensive wall made of flames. You think that can stop me? How naive. Baek Jae-jai knew that her trick wouldn't work. His treasured noble warrior's sword cut through the flames, inching towards her neck. Clang! Ranyang used her experience to catch the Supreme Commander's sword that was covered in bluish-black energy between her palms, which had been strengthened with internal energy. Are you stopping it with your hands? Indeed, how monstrous. It would be a difficult fight. He had competed with her several times before, but had never been able to defeat her. However, the purpose of the Supreme Commander wasn't to suppress her. His goal was something else. Baek Jae-jai spoke as he used his chi to push the sword. Guardian! Don't you remember this technique? Didn't you make it for His Majesty, who carried this sword? Right. The sword technique, which the Supreme Commander had used, had been created by her. By showing it to her, he wanted to make her remember the loyalty she had towards the Imperial family. Remember that moment. With those words, Baek Jae-jai's eyes met with Ranyang's. The trembling sword in her hand stopped. Ah! Baek Jae-jai's eyes lit up, thinking that he had achieved his goal. At that very moment. Crack! Broke! Ah! The bright face of Baek Jae-jai suddenly distorted. The gift from His Majesty the Emperor, the legendary noble warrior's sword, which he treasured more than his own life, had been broken. My MYYYYYY sword. As they followed the sword's fragments which fell to the ground, Baek Jaejai's eyes were filled with despair, grief, and deep sorrow. Ranyang's annoyed voice then entered his ears. What was I supposed to remember? Don't force your stupid memories on a woman you barely know. You. Wing. Pang. Quack. Before he could even say anything, the spear-shaped flame had struck his chest. His body, which had been hit with the flame chi, was flung backwards as the chi pierced his chest. Bang! Supreme Commander! Yongzhou, the northern commander, caught him as he flew across the room. Hack! This! Tada. He'd managed to catch the Supreme Commander, but the force of the attack was so strong that even his body was pushed back. Even the best swordsman in the Imperial Palace couldn't reach her level. Huh. In the end, you are no different from the other males who are obsessed with the past. For Ranyang, the memories in the shrine were never considered happy ones. She didn't even consider them as memories. It was just a period of psychological torture as she'd endured the severe loneliness of losing her fellow cult leaders, and kept her loyalty to complete the final order of her lord. She had already begun to forget all her pain as she was given new hopes, but this lowly man had just forced her to remember it. Quack. Creak. White air began flowing from Baek Jaejai's mouth. Even if he wanted to attack, his precious noble warrior's sword had been broken. Furthermore, he had to focus on calming the fire that was burning into his organs. As the Supreme Commander was wounded, Admiral Seo Tae-sik shouted whilst pointing his fingers at her. Guardian! Are you really going to betray His Majesty, the Emperor? Betray? Who is betraying whom, Admiral? Aren't your actions an act of betrayal and rebellion against the Empire? Isn't that what you are doing? At Seo Tae-sik's words, Ranyang shook her head and answered with a smirk. This woman in front of you has been living for the cult since the moment she was born. In the old days, I was ordered by the lord of the demonic cult to protect the treasure in the royal shrine, so how can you call this betrayal? The word betrayal was something Ranyang hated the most. She was one of the most loyal members of the demonic cult. However, even though he knew about her existence, Seo Tae-sik, the admiral, couldn't have known about the pact that had been made 200 years before. Demonic cult's orders? Hold on. What absurdity are you? Stop. That was when someone interrupted him. Your Majesty? The one who had stopped him was none other than the Emperor. Knowing that the lord of the demonic cult himself was present, he had decided to stay silent, but when he stepped forward, Admiral Seo Tae-sik had to keep his mouth shut. The Emperor made eye contact with Ranyang, who seemed proud of her actions, and started recalling the past. It was when he had inherited the throne that he had been told the truth. Emperor, listen to us. Strictly speaking, the Qilin's core and blood, the treasures kept in the royal shrine, actually do not belong to the Imperial family. Not to our family? He was too shocked to understand what that actually meant. He was later informed of the contents of the contract which had been signed by the past emperor. The Great Guardian, Ranyang, is a member of the demonic cult who signed a contract with the first emperor at the founding of the empire to protect the treasure. Originally, the first emperor had known that the men from the demonic cult, who were there to protect the treasures of the royal shrine, would disappear over time. He thought that if everyone disappeared over time, the treasure would soon be forgotten by the cult. However, something totally unexpected had happened. The last remaining member of the cult, Mun Ranyang, had managed to consume the Qilin's blood, and therefore to increase her lifespan. I knew that this day might come soon. The first emperor hadn't thought that its blood would be absorbed in his time. If the core and the blood in the royal shrine were used by too many people, the contract between the demonic cult and imperial family would become meaningless. With that in mind, Ranyang had decided to stay behind and guard the core and blood. But now, the lord of the demonic cult himself had appeared. The words of the guardian hold truth. There is no doubt that she is a member of the demonic cult. The emperor meekly admitted the truth. At the emperor's words, all the officials inside the circle of flame were astonished. A secret that no one knew had been revealed. The hidden truth that the Chelan's blood and core, which were considered to be treasures of the empire, actually belonged to the demonic cult. Furthermore, the person who was considered to be the hidden power of the palace was also a member of the demonic cult. How could this? The treasure of the royal shrine belongs to the demonic. Contrary to the embarrassed officials, Chen Yuan started to see the emperor in a different light. They were in the middle of the imperial palace. The emperor could act strong or even distort the truth, but he had decided to admit it. The emperor's magnanimity is a lot greater than we thought. Indeed, the emperor was surely an astonishing person. Chen Yuan felt satisfied. In such a chaotic atmosphere, the emperor spoke again. So you are the lord of the demonic cult? When the emperor spoke again, his tone was back to normal. The officials were in utter shock. Even the people of Yulin were shocked to see the emperor treating the demonic cult's lord as his equal. That is right, your majesty. Chen Yuan answered in a softer voice. However, just because the beginning of the conversation went smoothly, didn't mean that it would end smoothly. There is something I must say first. Thank you for helping my second son, the Prince Zhu Taikon. However, this is the Imperial Palace. Gradually, the emperor's voice rose. The signing of the non-aggression treaty doesn't give you the right to break into the Imperial Palace and make a fuss without my permission. He wasn't wrong. Chen Yuan and his members had in fact snuck into the Imperial Palace without permission. If the emperor asked him to take responsibility for his actions, he had no argument to refute it. If only those Blade God's 6 martial clan bastards hadn't created this mess. I am sorry if this has made you uncomfortable, your majesty. Maybe there are some misunderstandings which need to be cleared up. It was then. Swua. Before Chen Yuan's words were finished, sharp energy rose from all directions and the flames, which were isolating the guards and eunuchs, were extinguished instantly. Shh. At the same time, one eunuch from the cardinal spear knelt before the emperor. A handsome young man, but at first glance, he looked like a eunuch, and was pretty enough to be considered a woman. He is fast. Li Homing's eyes narrowed. He hadn't felt a single person move. The young eunuch, who knelt and bowed in front of the emperor, spoke. I apologize to your majesty. As ordered, I tried to stay still and watch, but I didn't have any other option but to come over as I judged the situation to be turning dangerous. Ranyang, who had been confident up until then, trembled and muttered. Guardian. A young eunuch could extinguish Ranyang's flames? His true identity was that he was the true guardian, the emperor's true, hidden guardian. The entire air around them changed with his movements. I was going to call for you anyway. Give me the order. The emperor looked at Chen Yuan with a solemn expression and spoke. The lord of the demonic cult has invaded the imperial palace at his discretion, and without permission. This means that he has taken the power of the imperial palace extremely lightly. From this moment on, I want you to show him the true power of the Imperial Palace. Chapter 377. The Imperial Escort. Part 5. The real hidden guardian escort. Unlike Guardian Ranyang, whose existence was at least known in the Imperial Palace, this one was totally unknown. There had been many rumors about the existence of the Guardian Escort. In the past, when the military rebellion had broken out, there was a rumor that this so-called Guardian Escort had protected the emperor from more than 300 military soldiers who'd broken into the palace. He'd cut every single one of their heads off. The Guardian Escort? Admiral Xiao Taisik, of the Cardinal Spear, was puzzled. Because even though he had heard about the existence of the Guardian Escort, he'd never seen him before. What was more shocking was that this eunuch had come out of the cardinal spear. "Is it someone you know?" Seo Taesik asked the leader Sang, who was next to him. Leader Sang, who directly selected and managed the eunuchs, shook his head as it was also his first time seeing this man. "Admiral Seo. There was never such a person in our group, even when we gathered inside, he hadn't been present." Huh. He wasn't a member of the Cardinal Spear, which meant that he'd joined in secretly. By disguising himself. This is such a weird day. I see two legends of the Imperial Palace at the same time. Ranyang, the Master of Guardians, responsible for protecting the underground shrine. And the Guardian Escort, who protected the Emperor and moved like his shadow, without revealing himself to anyone. People who had never revealed themselves before. He seems well. Ranyang looked at the pretty-faced eunuch who was called the Guardian Escort, with narrowed eyes. The moment she saw him, she immediately recognized him. However, until the moment he'd appeared, she hadn't even been aware of his existence. In the past, I was at least able to sense him. Although her flames looked simple, they actually weren't. Extinguishing the flame meant that his martial arts had developed a lot since the last time she'd met him. A person who is totally incomparable to admirals, the strongest swordsman Northern Commander, or even the strongest warrior Supreme Commander. The Emperor looked at the Guardian Escort, with eyes filled with trust. The true power of the Imperial Palace, what do you exactly mean by that? Chen Yuan's eyes narrowed after hearing the Emperor's confident words. It was no different from saying that the demonic cult members were to be suppressed by force. The Emperor spoke to the eunuch, who was still kneeling. "Get up." "Yes. Your Majesty." As the eunuch rose, the Emperor pointed to him and introduced him. "This person is called Lim Gua, my personal escort." At the introduction of the Emperor, the eunuch smiled and bowed whilst looking at Chen Yuan. "I greet the Lord of the demonic cult." At first glance, he looked like a woman with a slender figure. It would be more believable if someone said he was a woman disguised as a man. Even the name is feminine. Gua meant sunflower. It was unusual for men to use the character Wa in their names. Lim Gua? Unlike Chen Yuan, who stared at him calmly, Great Guardian Mara Kim titled his head. It was definitely his first time seeing this man, but he had heard the name somewhere before. He was sure he had heard it somewhere, but when he tried to recall it, nothing came to mind. The Emperor continued speaking. "I don't know much about martial arts, but it was said that the people of Wulin would usually judge right from wrong by fighting, right? The weak bow to the strong. Was it? The weak bow to the strong." The words which best described the world of Wulin. Wulin was based on the ideology of survival of the fittest. Wulin considered whoever was strongest to be the bearer of truth. It seemed like the Emperor's intentions were to use those words to turn the tables. Regardless of the reason, the demonic cult invaded my palace, harmed my servants and broke the arms of the crown prince, my son, and a member of the imperial family. Chen Yuan had accomplished a feat that no other person from Wulin had managed to achieve. The Emperor was bound to be angry. Nevertheless, the Emperor tried to treat him respectfully considering his position as the lord of the demonic cult, one of the three major powers of Wulin, and someone with whom he had signed the non-aggression treaty. This alone is enough to say that you have broken the pact first. Wouldn't it be a disgrace to me, the Emperor, if I just turned a blind eye to this? Your Majesty. How could you say that? Hearing the word disgrace come out the Emperor's mouth, the people present began to whisper. If it wasn't for their Emperor's presence, those men would definitely try to take down the arrogant infiltrators of the demonic cult to prove their loyalty. Chuck. The Emperor raised his hand and gestured for the others to shut their mouths. And he spoke again. As I said, it is unacceptable to let you go without any kind of punishment. So, here is my suggestion. My escort here is the best warrior and the strongest martial artist in the Imperial Palace, I can assure you of that. At the Emperor's words, Yongzhou, the northern commander's face turned red in embarrassment. He was called the best swordsman in the Imperial Palace, but his title was meaningless if the Emperor didn't acknowledge it. Even though you have been disrespectful to me and the Empire, I still have no intentions of overriding the agreement that the first Emperor had with you people. Chen Yuan laughed to himself at how the Emperor kept saying that he held no hostility towards them. Yet, he constantly pointed out the faults of Chen Yuan and the demonic cult. At first, it seemed like the Emperor was angry and ended up revealing his secret weapon, but that didn't seem to be the real purpose. I will make concessions, and I will respect Wulin laws. If you can defeat this escort of mine, I am willing to pretend that nothing happened here today. Ignoring what happened wasn't a bad proposal. However, that meant that the Emperor was certain that his guardian escort would manage well. Chen Yuan asked, "What if I can't defeat your guardian escort?" "I will amend the non-aggression treaty." Chen Yuan's eyebrow rose at the words of amending the non-aggression treaty. So this was his true goal. He knew that there would be a price, but unexpectedly, the Emperor was asking for too much. The Forces of Justice faction swears allegiance to the Empire regardless of the non-aggression treaty, right? Huh. The Emperor looked down at someone who was still bowing. It was none other than Elder Chongsu and his disciples, who were long-time envoys of the Forces of Justice. A confrontation between the Emperor's men and the demonic cult had occurred suddenly. They had remained bowing to show that they were unaware of the happenings and wanted no part. "We are in trouble." Elder Chongsu, who had been waiting for the situation to be settled, didn't know what to do. The Emperor's question was too sensitive for him to answer. These kinds of things always happen when the demonic cult gets involved. Without the demonic cult, he would have had a chance to fall into the good graces of His Majesty and be made into an official of the Empire. However, if he said that he would side with the Emperor in front of one of the three strongest powers of Wulin, the demonic cult, it would be nothing less than a declaration of death once he returned back from the Empire. Is it not? Your Majesty, that. It was a situation in which he couldn't answer. If he answered incorrectly, he would later get criticized by the other leaders of the Forces of Justice, and even the alliance with the demonic cult might break. As he continued to hesitate, the Emperor's expression hardened. Chongsu was beginning to break out in cold sweat. "So if we can't defeat this guardian of yours, do you want the demonic cult to become servants of the Empire, and not a member of the non-aggression treaty anymore?" Thank God. Thankfully, Chen Yuan had intervened. To Elder Chongsu, who was facing a dilemma, Chen Yuan looked like his savior. Thanks to that, the Emperor's hardened face turned to Chen Yuan. "What will it be?" Elder Chongsu looked at Chen Yuan, who didn't seem to fear anything. If he had committed to the Emperor's words, he would have missed a good chance to rise in Yulin and would have found himself in an embarrassing situation. Did he intervene because of the alliance we have with him? Elder Chongsu's eyes fluttered. Even if there was an alliance, Yulin and the demonic cult were bound to return back to hostile relations once their goal was achieved. Yet, even in front of the Emperor, he was helping a member of the Forces of Justice. Oh, God. Heavenly God. Elder Chongsu couldn't help but admire Chen Yuan. To help a person who would be of no use to him in any situation meant that Chen Yuan sincerely respected the alliance. So this is the current lord of the demonic cult? I thought he was just reckless, but he has courage, tolerance, and the qualities of a true warrior. In the beginning, Elder Chongsu had only thought of him as a dangerous man. However, the way he looked at Yuan had changed. Actually, he had misunderstood something. You must be out of your mind to try and take the Forces of Justice under the control of the Imperial Palace. Chen Yuan's intervention wasn't to help the Forces of Justice. Looking at the bewildered expression on Elder Changsu's face, he knew that he would sooner or later make a decision favorable to the Imperial Palace. However, if Changsu, a man from the forces of justice, swore allegiance to the Imperial family, then they would fall under its control. The people of the forces of justice would reprimand this elder for a long time because of his decision, but even so they wouldn't be able to undo what had already been agreed upon. If that happened, the emperor would surely try to take the Yulin under his governance. The emperor's eyes held a look of regret. If Chen Yuan hadn't been involved, the emperor would have naturally brought the forces of justice under him, but he had failed. I didn't think he would have political or diplomatic skills yet, but he is already pretty good. The envoy from Yulin was currently there as a representative of the forces of justice. The emperor could have gotten what he wanted from that person himself, such a pity. However, it wasn't like this was the last opportunity. Yes. Because your cult had been instrumental at the time of hounding, the first emperor had signed the non-aggression treaty out of goodwill and gave you freedom. When a favor continues, it gets mistaken for a privilege. Trusting the non-aggression between Wulin and the empire only disturbed the peace in the Imperial Palace. Shouldn't you then pay the price? He spoke for so long, giving out sensible reasons, but there was only one conclusion. If they lost, the demonic cult would have to swear allegiance to the empire. He may appear as a dignified emperor, but he was resourceful and quick in making use of opportunities. He wasn't the kind to let go of something once he knew that he had it in his hand. Both Marakim and Li Hamming were puzzled. They'd guessed that the emperor was planning something, but they hadn't thought that he would use the situation to his benefit in such a mischievous way. At that time, Ranyang's words entered Marakim's ears. The Great Guardian, right? We need to stop this offer right now. What do you mean? The emperor is making this offer because he is confident that he will win. Confident in winning? I don't know everything, as I always stayed in this shrine, but I heard that there is not a single person in Wulin who wouldn't know the name Lim Gua. Lim Gua. Great Guardian. Marakim's eyes widened. He knew that he'd heard the name somewhere, but when Ranyang said it, something striked. Wave Sword Lim Gua. Lim Gua, the Wave Sword. He was once one of the 5 strongest warriors of the Middle East, and was called the Sword Emperor. Like a comet in Wulin, he was an absolute figure with his unique swordsmanship. He was a great man, and everyone hoped that he would turn into the best swordsman in the entire world after he defeated the King of Destroying Sword, who was the top of the 5 great warriors and skilled swordsmen of that time. But I heard that he only worked in Wulin for 1 year and disappeared after that. It was in the past, more than 90 years ago. It was something Marakim couldn't recall at once, because it was a story he'd heard as a child. Which meant that the eunuch was currently 120 years old. Even considering him undergoing metamorphosis, his current appearance made no sense. No way. He has survived for many years by drinking the Qilint's blood. Qilint's blood. Right. Lim Gua, Wave Sword. He was a native from the city of eunuchs, and he was the only man who survived the experiment of taking in Qilint's blood. With his success, the Imperial Palace had forced dozens of eunuchs to drink the blood, but they had all burned to death, making him the only one who could take it. Lord of the demonic cult. You have no choice but to accept my offer. The emperor had given enough reasons. If he refused, it meant that Chen Yuan was acknowledging that he and his subordinates couldn't defeat the Guardian Escort. If that happened, the Imperial Palace could spread a rumor, stating that they had the power to subdue the demonic cult. My escort was the first admiral of the East Spear. He was very skilled even before consuming the Qilint's blood. His skills are well known throughout the entirety of Wulin too. The emperor was confident in winning his bet. Whatever the situation, he would never lose. At that time, Chen Yuan passed by Ranyang and walked forward. He had come to a decision. Nice. to accept my wing." Before the emperor could finish his words, a jet black flame rose from Chen Yuan's right hand, and soon formed into a sword. It was the sky demon sword imbued with the Qilance flame, the invisible sword. Black flame? There were times when the emperor invited masters from various factions of Wulin to learn about qi and internal energy, but never once had he felt such an eerie energy. What is that? The emperor was puzzled by the unknown energy he was feeling for the first time. That was when Lim Guihua, who was standing proudly for a moment, spoke in a voice of urgency. Your Majesty. Please hold off the fight for a moment." It was then. Ah. In the blink of an eye, Chen Yuan appeared in front of Lim Guihua. Even he, who was considered the strongest by the emperor, a supreme master-level warrior, was quick to know something was off. What is he? Flustered, Lim Guihua drew his golden wave sword from his waist. The wave sword moved around like a whip, and then formed air like waves in the sky, creating high-quality shields. I had to make it in a hurry. It was a sword shield which was made from the technique of the wave sword. This sword contained the techniques of the flower rain from sky, which makes that shield stronger with every attack it received. Chick. Fut. 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 Chen Yuan's black flame sword hit the wave sword shield. With each hit, another wave shield would form, making it impossible for the black flame to penetrate the shield. He had defended the emperor urgently, but he knew that the attack could be prevented. However, Wuong. Crack. No. Lim Guihua's eyes widened. The wave sword shield, which was supposed to get stronger with every attack, was suddenly pierced. It was a natural thing to happen, as Chen Yuan was using the invisible sword. However, he didn't know that the black flame sword in Chen Yuan's hand was the invisible sword. No, this is the invisible sword. Shocked by the crack in his shield, Lim Guihua tried to widen the distance, but the black flaming sword had already brushed past his right arm. Quack. Lim Guihua's right arm, which was supposed to be holding the wave sword, fell to the ground. Thud. The arm which had fallen to the ground immediately started burning with black smoke. Kuok. Aside from the pain, he knew that his life was at risk. And no, he can't be trying to kill me in here? He was in front of the emperor and the other officials. Lim Guihua, who felt his life being threatened, was taken aback and stabbed towards Chen Yuan's chest with the sword in his left hand. But, puck. Quack. A sword of black flames, which was too fast for the naked eye to see, slashed his throat. Feeling the pain of being cut and the pain of burning at the same time was the worst pain he had ever felt, a pain he couldn't describe. Lim Guihua muttered under his breath with blood-stained, fear-filled eyes. Indeed. Div. Divine. Moss. Thud. Unfortunately, he couldn't complete what he wanted to say before he fell to the ground. How is this possible? The emperor, who was flustered by what had happened in the blink of an eye, was approached by Chen Yuan, as he walked away from Lim Guihua's body. Fack. With the most cynical smile on his face he said, "Your Majesty is right. When a favor continues, it gets mistaken for a privilege, right?"